Hello. So our two reading responses were um, talk about the lens of social construction to analyze the politics of uranium mining in Australia and why are Aboriginals in Australia's Northern Territory weary of embracing notions of both economic development and wilderness preservation, particularly as it relates to uranium mining. So these kind of go hand in hand. So obviously the Aboriginals were not consulted at all when it initially came to uranium mining in Australia. Like, I forget the term for it, but it was like that unclaimed land thing. And so that's why the British came in the first place, was because they wanted it first. And initially they were just doing like farming and hunting and trapping and, selling skins and whatnot. And so the Aboriginals were actually employed a lot in that stuff. So I imagine that actually probably helped out they probably didn't really have an economy at that point, but I digress. And then the only reason the Brits stuck around in the first place, after they, kind of got sick of it, was the uranium. I think in the textbook it said Australia exports nearly 100% of its uranium and like doesn't even have any power plants, which is really interesting. And yeah, so how that social construction comes into play is like it was literally a made-up rule that anyone could like claim to Australia because it was unclaimed, and then it was another made-up rule that the Brits were the ones who won it, I guess you could say, and then it was yet another made-up rule that the Brits were the ones who deserved all of the uranium because they were there first. So it's just kind of crazy when you think about it. And obviously the Aboriginals were not consulted at all. I think in the textbook it said they weren't brought into the politics of it until 1970, after they'd been there for like 100 years. So it's ridiculous. And why the Aboriginals in Australia's Northern Territory are weary of, the discourse between economic development and wilderness preservation is because a lot of us view that as an either or. It's like you can either preserve the wilderness, get everybody out of there, including the indigenous people who live there, and leave it alone, which I don't agree with, or economic development, which either way people get displaced. And as you see in a lot of indigenous cultures, they lived very harmoniously with the environment. Like here in the States, the Native Americans lived super harmoniously with the environment. The Aboriginals in Australia lived super harmoniously with the environment. Didn't take too much, so on and so forth. And so when we come in with this westernized, like, no, wilderness is wilderness and we have to leave it alone, and everyone has to get out if we want to preserve it, they're just like, dude, we've literally been doing this for centuries and it was fine before you guys came along. So I think people really need to figure out a balance and just like let people practice their culture in peace, maybe. But at the same time, the uranium mine is smack dab in the middle of the huge wilderness preservation area. And so it's like, yeah, like developing that would be amazing for Australia's economy, because they'd become energy independent if they took advantage of the resources that they have. They would literally be energy independent. But then they'd have to go traipsing around this protected area. And so it's kind of like darned if you do, darned if you don't type situation. And I imagine the Aboriginals are pretty sick of it, because at first they weren't even consulted at all. And then back in the 70s, people were like, oh, hey, yeah, you should probably be part of this. You've lived here for centuries. And they're just being forced into a choice, and they shouldn't be. I think, obviously I don't know a ton about Australia's politics, so I can't really speak with too much knowledge on this, but I think they just need to find a middle ground. Like, obviously they're already exporting uranium, and I know they just recently closed like this mountain rock face thing that people used to climb because it was actually sacred land to the indigenous people, and they finally closed it and like took away all the climbing assists that they had drilled into the surface. So it looks like they're moving in the right direction towards listening to their indigenous people more, but like most westernized first world countries, we have a lot further to go when it comes to consulting with our indigenous peoples and, respecting their way of life, i.e. Mount Rushmore. If you don't know what the Grandfather's Mountain is, you should look it up. And yeah, so short story long, just let the people who live there make their own decisions and quit trying to just yank them back and forth on this issue that they literally had no choice in the first place. So yeah.